is recorded. Okay, so welcome and thank you all of you for joining today's webinar. My name is Dr. Sofia Wenzler. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and the clinical lead here at Trichotillomania. And today we're gonna talk about people pleasing as a pattern and its connection to hair pulling, the cost of always saying yes when you actually want to say no. And this webinar is brought to you by TrichStop, the therapist-guided online therapy program that you already know because you signed up for this webinar. Anyways, so I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes, and at the end, we're going to have a Q&A section. And I really want to encourage you to stick around until the end because we're also going to have a promo code for you for your first subscription of $100. If you come up with a question, then you can ask it in the Q&A section during the presentation or after. I just want to ask you to not raise your hands. Just write every question down in the Q&A section. And even if you have a follow-up question, I usually get to that. All right, so let's jump right into it. In the beginning, we're going to do a quick self-test if you actually have people-pleasing features, or if that is a pattern that you might find within you. Then we're going to talk about where it actually comes from, how we develop this pattern. We're going to see what the connection is between approval seeking and hair pulling. And when I say approval seeking or people pleasing, it basically is very similar. In everyday language, we talk more about people pleasing, but if we talk about the actual pattern, as psychologists, oftentimes we refer to it as approval seeking. Then we're going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of this pattern, and I'm going to give you some ideas of what you can do if you want to reduce people-pleasing behavior. Then we're going to conclude and jump into the Q&A section. All right, so are you a people pleaser? Actually, there's questionnaires that can measure that. And I brought to you 5 statements from one questionnaire where you can go through those questions with me and check for yourself. Okay, so each one of those statements, you can check whether you agree with them on a scale from 1 to 6. 1 would be completely untrue of me, and 6 describes me perfectly. First one is, it is important to me to be liked by almost everyone I know. From 1 to 6. The second one, I change myself depending on the people I'm with, so they like me more. From 1 to 6. The third one, my self-esteem is based mostly on how other people view me. Even if I don't like someone, I still want him or her to like me. Unless I get a lot of attention from others, I feel less important. Okay, and now I want you to take each one of those scores that you gave yourself, add them up to a sum, and divide them by 5. To create an average. And now for reference, right, if you're asking yourself, is this average actually high or low? The average in a non-clinical sample, meaning in a sample of people who don't suffer from psychological disorders, would be 2.74. So if, for example, your average is 4, then that is a sign of an approval-seeking pattern. Okay, I'm so sorry. My dog is is crying. I need to tell my husband to take her out for a second. I'll be back in 1 second. I'm so sorry. That hasn't had never happened before. Yeah, I always take my dog to work. Anyway, so now you should have some idea of whether this pattern may or may not apply to you. Some additional statements that people that score high in approval seeking usually agree with are: I spend a lot of time on my physical appearance, so people will value me. Accomplishments are most valuable to me if other people notice them. I'm so focused on fitting in that sometimes I don't know who I am. I find it hard to set my own goals without taking into account how others will respond to my choices. And when I look at my life decisions, I see that I make most of them with other people's approval in mind. Now let's think about where and how this pattern evolves. So usually, approval seeking and other similar patterns develop very early on in childhood. Um, the way we look at it is that every child has core emotional needs, just like we have physical needs of being fed and having a roof over our heads, we have core emotional needs. And every pattern, whether it's approval seeking or another pattern that we work on in therapy, usually evolved because there was some need that wasn't met in our childhood. And this pattern is basically our coping mechanism that we learned in order to cope with that unmet need. But today it's not helpful anymore. Okay, so I'm going to explain that further. Those emotional needs that we have can be categorized, for example, as I am showing you in this graph. The most central need when we're born, first of all, is a secure attachment to our primary caretakers. That includes feeling safe, feeling a sense of stability, nurturance, and acceptance. Obviously, that's the basis. Every human needs that, right? But then as we grow up and explore the world, we also have this need for autonomy, the feeling that we can be competent, that we can have self-efficacy, our own identity, that we can achieve things becomes important as well. Then on the left, you see the core need for spontaneity, play, sensuality, sexuality. That need, a lot of adults, when I ask them, don't think about it. We forget that that is actually an emotional need we have. In the middle, you have the need for realistic limits and self-control, the fact that we need our world to be predictable to a certain degree. That is very important, obviously, for children. They need rules, they need rituals, but still, as adults, we still have this need. And the one that's going to be specifically relevant for us is the need that's specifically going to be relevant for us today is the need to express valid needs and emotions freely and to be accepted with all those needs and emotions um, by the people around us. And sometimes that's hard to understand or differentiate from secure attachment, right? So secure attachment is the feeling that you're loved and accepted doesn't necessarily mean that you're seen with all your colors and um, all of the sides you have to you. Okay, someone can very much love you, but not give you the freedom to express every part of you. I'm going to also later on give you an example because sometimes that sounds abstract in the beginning. And this need comes from the fact that every child is dependent on their parents' attention, right? Our parents' attention is a really, really important currency for us as children. Evolutionarily, we wouldn't even survive without our parents' attention. So children are primed to do whatever they need to do to get their parents' attention. And then if there's an obstacle in the way, for example, children that are raised in a context of being chronically overlooked, such as large families that might not get the attention that they need, children who are neglected, for example, when parents are battling their own psychological issues, might not get the attention that they need. But even more frequently, what I see is children who get attention in their core family only for parts of them, only for the parts that are well behaved, or the parts that perform well, or the parts that takes care of the parents' needs first, right? And then there's a part of them that doesn't get attention, a part of them that they feel is not accepted or seen or loved. And that part is usually pushed aside, and the other part is being exaggerated, or is being grows or takes up some more space. Um, so approval seeking or this people pleasing behavior usually comes from a place of that's what I need to do to get the attention as a child. It's a learned behavior that was necessary once and is problematic now. I needed it when I was a child because I grew up in in an environment where this was my best way to get my parents' attention and approval. Here's a case example. Paula was the middle child in a large family with 6 siblings. Her parents were loving but overwhelmed, often too busy managing the household to give each child individualized attention. Since there were so many children, Sarah felt that she had to compete for love, praise, and recognition. So here you see it's not that parents aren't loving or doing their best. Sometimes the circumstances are just making not making it possible for the child to get everything they need. So Paula noticed that the siblings who behaved well, got good grades or helped around the house, received more praise and attention. If she cried, complained, or expressed her own needs, she was often told, "Stop being dramatic. There are more important things to worry about." So if she shows those sides of herself that are actually focused on her own needs, when she complains, if she demands something, if she says something's not okay for me, I need attention here, then she's being rejected. Wanting to be noticed and appreciated, Paula learned that the best way to gain approval was by being helpful, agreeable, and obedient. And those other parts of her that are more with a focus on her own needs and demand something from the parents were pushed to the side. So again, it's really important to remember this is a learned behavior that was once really useful for Paula. That's what she needed to survive in this family. But as a grown-up, it can cause problems. So this is where the pattern comes from. Let's look at what this actually feels like inside when this pattern is triggered. There's always a reaction. That's also why it's called a pattern, right? That involves certain thoughts and assumptions, emotions, and a behavior that then follows. And in terms of the thoughts and assumptions, usually, I mean, it can take many different shapes, but usually what's at the core of it is being liked, accepted, loved, or worthy is connected to an if. The assumption and deep belief that I am only going to be loved, accepted, appreciated if I do the right things, if I perform. So you're constantly striving, constantly struggling for this feeling of being liked, accepted, or loved, and you can never be sure of it. This can look like my worth depends on others' opinions of me. Conflict or disagreement means rejection. If I say no, people will stop liking me. Making a mistake means people will think less of me. Those are common assumptions for people who have this approval seeking pattern. And it comes on the other side with a deep fear of being abandoned or disapproved of, a deep fear that if I don't live up to those expectations, I'm going to lose those relationships and I'm going to be left alone. And when we don't get it right, when we don't manage to please, when someone is actually disapproves of us, is not pleased or angry, then we can also feel intense shame or embarrassment. And this is obviously not a very comfortable state to be in. If I think that way and feel that way, it doesn't feel good. I don't want to be in this place. So I will show some kind of behavior to relieve this inner conflict. And interestingly, that behavior can be people pleasing, but it doesn't have to be people pleasing. So if the pattern is I'm seeking other people's approval, I will not necessarily engage in people pleasing behavior. There's actually two other options that I just want to briefly mention. And those three options, surrender, avoidance, and overcompensation, can be very neatly aligned with our basic response instincts in every situation, which would be fight, flight, or freeze, right? The ones that we're born with. So surrender is a freeze reaction. People pleasing is a freeze reaction. Flight avoidance is a flight reaction, and overcompensation is a fight reaction. So let's look at an example that would trigger this approval seeking pattern. Let's say a friend asks me out whether I want to go, ask me whether I want to go out tonight, right? And I don't want to because I'm tired. It's a very realistic example. And I think to myself, no, but saying no is not something I'm comfortable with because I will have automatic thoughts of like, but will she think I'm boring? Will she not ask me again? Will she be mad at me? Will she feel like I'm not being a good friend? Am I living up to her expectations, right? And those thoughts and assumptions will cause some kind of fear or anxiety. And then if I, for example, fight the situation, that if I go into overcompensation mode, I will almost do the opposite of people pleasing. I will say approval is a trap. I don't need it. If I push people away, they can judge me and they can disappoint me, right? I still have this fear and this assumption that I have to meet other people's expectations, but I'm like completely going against it. And I will maybe answer something very direct or even aggressive, something like, no, I don't want to go. I don't have to say yes to everything. I have my own plans. Leave me alone. And push people away. An avoidance reaction would be avoidance actually can take all kinds of different shapes. It could be ignoring the text and then later saying, well, I'm so sorry I missed it. If only I had seen it earlier, I would have gone with you, right? Then you avoid doing something you don't want to do without facing the anger or disappointment, kind of. You could drink alcohol and then saying no will not make you feel this fear, and you might not listen to those negative thoughts as much. Or you can outsource this and get another person to say no for you, or say, well, my partner just what really wanted to spend the night with me. I'm so sorry. It's not my fault. I really wanted to go with you. Just to avoid actually saying, no, I don't want to go. And that's okay. I'm so sorry. I don't want to go. And then we have the surrender reaction, which is people pleasing, which would be to say, yes, of course, I'm going to go with you. No problem. And this is not carved in stone, right? It's not that if I have an approval seeking pattern, I will always go into surrender mode or always avoid or always overcompensate. I can sometimes kind of fall into this direction and sometimes into the other. It also depends on a person's temperament and personality. But those are basically the three options of how to, the three options that that I automatically react when I have an approval seeking pattern that work in the short term but cause problems in the long term. Obviously, the healthy way would be to set, an empathetic, friendly boundary. All right. So this people-pleasing behavior can take all kinds of shapes and forms. It can be saying what you think people want to hear, having different versions of oneself depending on who one is with, difficulty making decisions without someone signing them off, even if the person signing them off is only in your imagination. feeling unsure about what your real tastes or preferences are, adopting the tastes or hobbies of loved ones rather than your own, feeling hurt when others disagree with you, having difficulty saying no and apologizing too often, which is also a very common one. Now, let's look at approval seeking and hair pulling. Is there a connection? And if yes, why? And actually, there's a really, really interesting research. That research is done with people who suffer from skin picking disorder, not hair pulling, unfortunately. I wish they would have included both. But since there's not always an abundance of research when it comes to BFRB, I'm still going to present this one also because we know that a lot of features between hair pulling and skin picking are the same. So it's not really completely wrong to draw comparisons between the two of them. And also because it's a really interesting research. And what they did is, remember there's those core emotional needs. And I told you basically every pattern that we might develop that we then try to work on in therapy can be connected to some unmet need in childhood. And so actually there is not only approval seeking as a pattern, there's 18 different patterns, at least according to some psychological theories. And there is a very interesting research paper from 2020 where those researchers kind of test or examine the connection between those 18 patterns. I have the list here of 18 patterns we can develop based on unmet needs in childhood and skin picking. And not only did they test this connection, they even tested for 3 subtypes of skin picking, that is automatic skin picking, focused skin picking, and mixed, both of them, skin picking. And they found that there are 3 patterns that are especially, that are highly correlated with skin picking, and those are mistrust, abuse, failure, and approval seeking. So first and foremost, there is a connection between approval seeking and skin picking, and most likely also hair pulling. Just we're not going to obviously go through all of those 18 patterns, but if you're interested in the 2 other ones, I'm just going to explain that briefly. So mistrust, abuse is a pattern of people that usually grew up in an environment that was not safe, where their trust was abused. So that could be due to actual abuse, physical, sexual, or psychological. It could be due to growing up in a family where you couldn't trust others because they lied or were manipulative. It can be due to severe bullying and things that are kind of fall into those lines. And it leads to kind of later being very vigilant, feeling like you can't trust anyone, like you're feeling like your radar is off, like you can never know, which obviously can cause a lot of problems, specifically in relationships. And then failure is a pattern that we developed if, as children, we repeatedly felt like we couldn't live up to certain expectations. For example, if we had learning difficulties like dyslexia or ADHD, or parents that had really high expectations of us, where we just couldn't live up to those expectations. And it just leads to this belief that you're fundamentally, that you will fail, or that you're fundamentally inadequate in comparison to others. If we think about why hair pulling and approval seeking as a pattern might be connected, there's different reasons or causes, possible causes for that. And in all of them, the assumption is that there first was an approval seeking pattern, since it also develops early in childhood, and that approval seeking pattern actually led to hair pulling disorder then later on emerging. And so one factor could be body image, because if you have this approval seeking behavior or people pleasing behavior, appearance might be very important to you. And sometimes also with hair pulling, it's about appearance. It's about, getting rid of a specific hair that's in the wrong place. It is, after all, a grooming behavior. I know afterwards it can have all sorts of triggers and other connections. It's not always appearance, but it can be about appearance, and that might be connected to approval seeking in a way that this preoccupation is more likely to evolve. Another factor could be emotion regulation. So people with an approval seeking pattern rely on external validation, right? And that means that we're never safe because external validation is not stable, right? So we will necessarily at some point get it wrong, and that can lead to stress and feeling overwhelmed. And then hair pulling can serve as kind of a coping mechanism to self-soothe those overwhelming emotions. The same goes for the suppressed emotions that we have in that we see in this approval seeking pattern. So remember my example of being asked by a friend to go out in the evening. My first initial intuitive reaction was like, I don't want to, and some kind of, I don't know, antagonism or unwillingness. But those emotions were immediately suppressed. Sometimes we don't even feel them or connect to them because the urge to please is so strong, but they're still there and they need an outlet. And then again, the pulling can serve, as a way to self-soothe. And then finally, um, people with an approval seeking pattern are also more prone to feel ashamed if they feel like they haven't pleased someone else, if they feel like someone else is mad at them or they've done something wrong or not lived up to a certain expectation. And that is a state that is very uncomfortable, and also very similar to hair pulling, where also sometimes we feel ashamed after a pulling episode. And then just like when I had a pulling episode and I feel ashamed or bad about myself, I might just jump into the next one, right? The same goes for approval seeking. I might feel shame and then use hair pulling as a coping mechanism. Okay. So obviously, people pleasing is discussed a lot in the media. Most people know just vaguely what it is. I hope now you feel like you have some more knowledge on what its roots are, what it encompasses, and where it comes from. And then usually it's talked about with a negative connotation. So you might think that the question, even asking, should you stop, is unnecessary. Of course, you should stop. But that is oversimplified. Actually, when I notice this pattern with clients, oftentimes there's some resistance. Um, because there are some benefits to the behavior as well. And I want to look at that together with you. And at this point, I also want to remind you that people pleasing in and of itself is not a problem if it's kind of like one of the tools in your tool case, right? In your toolkit. If you everyone needs to please other people sometimes, it makes the other person feel good. It creates connection if you do it in measure. But if people pleasing is your automatic response, the response that you show most often, and if you really struggle to show a different response, for example, setting a boundary, then we talk about this pattern. And then we should think about whether it serves you, right, to behave this way or to act this way. And if you look at it as a cycle, which I love to do, then you would basically see, okay, there's a trigger that triggers the pattern, a primary reaction, a secondary reaction, short-term and long-term consequences. And that's always the point, the short-term and the long-term consequences. When there's a behavior that I know I actually kind of want to change, but I don't change it, that usually means, well, it has some benefits in the short term, but it has some causes problems in the long term. And that's a really important differentiation. So again, a very similar example, let's say your partner suggests doing something you don't enjoy. Your initial reaction is, I don't want to do that. But your approval seeking pattern is triggered, and you're afraid if you said no that your partner would love you less or be disappointed at you or pick a fight. And that's why you say yes instead of no. And then, and this is really important, you have in the short term a sense of relief. You feel safe. You feel like you managed the situation without escalation. And that feels really good. And this is where it stops for a lot of people. They say, well, this is very important. I'm saving the relationship. I'm taking care of my partner. The fact that I have needs is not important because I'm a very strong person. I can always focus on the other person's needs. It will not cause problems. We can go on like this forever. So they feel like the people pleasing gives them stronger relationships. They manage to avoid confrontation. They live in harmony. They are really very, very likable, valued in teams, and also empathetic. And that is true, but only in the short term. If we look at the long-term consequences, it looks different. So, for example, yes, people pleasing kind of affects relationships in a positive way in the short term, but think about what kind of relationship that is in the end. It's a very one-sided relationship. And I always want to also encourage you, if you have this approval seeking pattern, think about switch sides for a second. Think about whoever it is you're in a relationship with, whether it's a family member or a friend or a partner. Think about them for a second, right? And think about whether they would want you to do that. For example, if you ask your partner every night, what shall we eat? What do you want to order? What do you want to cook? And they always reply, whatever you want. Would I want a partner like that? I don't know. First of all, I would think, does do they not have any likes or preferences? And then also sometimes I would even get annoyed because I always have to make the decisions. I know the other person will always go with what I want, but that also gives me a lot of responsibility. It's one-sided, and it's the other part doesn't always want to be in a one-sided relationship, which already gives you the first clue that this people-pleasing behavior where we think we want to do whatever it takes to save the relationship in the long term actually damages the relationship. And that's really sad because it costs a lot to be pleasing all the time, and then in the end you don't even get the effect that you wanted. Yes, you avoid confrontation, but you also avoid necessary confrontation, right? Because sometimes confrontation is really important. If we don't talk about problems, uh, they they are still there. We can just not resolve them. And again, if you think about the other side, think about, a friend, family member, or partner, and then imagine you they do something that hurts you. Don't you think they would want to know? Right? Don't you think they would want to know if they do something that hurts you, if they love you? They might want to apologize, change their behavior, or justify why they did it. It's important to have confrontations. It's important to discuss things, and it's good for the relationship. This kind of avoiding confrontation and avoiding fighting can, in the short term, lead to harmony, but it oftentimes backfires because most people can't do that forever. Most people at some point start building up resentment. And that's a shame because if we're really in this approval seeking pattern, we kind of just try to please and please and please, although the other person obviously at some point will do things that bother us because we're all humans and that happens. And if I then don't talk about it and just try to create harmony and maintain this harmony, I still build up resentment because that behavior still bothers me even if I don't say it, right? The fact that someone accidentally steps on your toe doesn't mean it doesn't hurt, and it doesn't mean that it shouldn't happen again. If you don't talk about it, it will happen again. So all this resentment, and that's what I witnessed with clients a lot of times, and that's what oftentimes creates motivation to change, that resentment can build up and then in a moment of impulsivity just explode and explode the relationship with it. Or it implodes and all of a sudden you build up all of this resentment and then you just don't like the person anymore. And you leave them and they don't even know what happened. Um, yes, when you're people pleasing, you might be more likable, but also you're not being authentic. The other person, just like I described that sometimes this is how the pattern develops in childhood, right? Because your environment gives you the feeling that only one part of you is loved and accepted. The same thing happens when you're an adult. And if you want to be in a good relationship, you want the other person to know all your colors, right? And all your sides. And then the last one, people pleasing creates people that are very empathetic because they're constantly trying to figure out what other people want from them, how other people feel. And that is really true. A lot of people who have this approval seeking pattern, if you now think, wow, it really sucks that I have this pattern. Yes, it does. And yes, obviously, I think it's worth changing. But um, it also really is a superpower. It also really is a superpower, and you kind of create and hone this skill of having really, really, sorry, good antennas for what other people need. And if, again, this was only one tool in your toolkit, and you would also be able to set boundaries, confront other people at the same time, then you could use this tool to your own and the relationships benefit when you like, right? And then it's amazing. But it's always important to also be able to do the other thing. And if you and if we take this kind of part that makes you an empathetic person to an extreme, what oftentimes it happens is also you're disconnected from yourself. You're so focused on what other people think, need, or feel that this initial reaction of like, what do I want and what do I feel is almost, sorry, you could say this overrode, overridden. It gets over, there's an override to it. And sometimes that's something that I really have to work on with patients to kind of be able to even connect to what you want and need when you're next to another person. Yeah. So you're being very empathetic, but sometimes even disconnected. Okay, so what to do? For me, it's very important to stress that the fact that this pattern comes from childhood and um, has deep roots means that oftentimes we've been with this pattern for 10, 20, 30 years, depending on your age, right? So it is not something that's easily changed. It takes a lot of awareness and work and courage. And I'm going to give you some ideas of what you can do, but actually, mostly I want to just recommend therapy if you want to change something about that. Working on it with an experienced therapist, I think, is the best idea. I know from our therapists here at SkinPick and TrickStop, sorry, that oftentimes after you clients get some strategies and start working on their pulling behavior and feel like the symptoms start to decrease, that those are exactly the topics that come up and that then also take up space in the therapeutic process. And I think that's really beautiful. But even if you feel like TrickStop is not the right match for you, then just looking for a therapist in your area and start working on it. I think that's the best idea. That being said, here is just a little bit inspiration also from me because I always want to give you something practical to take away. So first of all, you have to understand that there are different stages of change. It's not like, okay, I have this pattern. people-pleasing behavior and I don't want to do it anymore. Okay, that's my goal. That's not how it works, okay? The first step of change is realizing, okay, I have this pattern and realizing what does it look like for me? How do I act when I'm in this people-pleasing mode? The second step is not only knowing I have this, but trying to catch myself in the act. And usually what happens first is I don't catch myself in the act, but I notice afterwards. Wow, I just had this conversation with my coworker. He criticized me. I immediately apologized a million times. Why did I do that? I didn't do anything wrong. Why did I apologize? Why did I show this people-pleasing behavior? I didn't notice in the moment, but I noticed afterwards. So that's the second important step towards change. The third one would be to be obviously to be aware while it happens. That that can be very frustrating because it doesn't mean that you're able to change your behavior yet. It still might be too scary, but it is another step. And then lastly, you want to actually act differently in the situation. And that works best, in my opinion, if you also learn your triggers and learn to anticipate those situations. Okay, my coworker just said that he wants to talk with me about this project. They might, because I know them, find some way to put the blame on me, but I'm not going to take that blame. I'm going to set a boundary. That if you're prepared like this and then go into the situation, the likelihood that you're going to be able to drop the people pleasing is higher. In my opinion, even exactly think about what you want to say, even role play with a friend, practice it. So once the situation happens and you might be scared, you will have an easier time to actually do it. And adjust your expectations. Usually when we stop with the people-pleasing behavior, it doesn't feel comfortable at all. It can feel really bad. You can feel like guilty, ashamed, scared. Um, and that's normal because change is not comfortable and change doesn't always feel good. But specifically with this pattern, it really can feel very bad in the beginning, but that is still a sign that you're on the right path. Also, what clients often say is that they are afraid that if they're too focused on their own needs, they might become selfish. Has never happened in my experience, but just to make you feel even more secure with this or calm you down even more, even if you were selfish for a little bit, that's okay. I would even congratulate that. Okay, you've been a people pleaser your whole life. Be a little bit selfish for a while. Switch from one side of the spectrum to the other in order to later on, find a healthier balance. Don't be afraid of being selfish. And just remember, this is something that you've probably been living with for a while. So celebrate the small steps and don't expect a lot of success immediately. It is a journey. And then if you feel like you have the awareness for this pattern and are able to understand when it happens, I think a good way to really approach or tackle this would be to create an exposure hierarchy. That is a concept that we know from CBT, from cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a way that you approach fears, and after all, people-pleasing behavior is a result of fear. So what you could do is for a week or two, try to take inventory of every people-pleasing behavior that you show in those 1 or 2 weeks. Just write it down in the evening or during the day on your phone. Every time you feel like, oh yeah, I did it again, I did it again, I did it again. And then make a list and sort all of those different situations by the distress level you would feel if you would stop that people-pleasing behavior. Okay? Just as an example, this could look like this. So distress level from 1 to 10, and then different kinds of situations where you could drop the people-pleasing and how distressed would you be? For example, and those are just examples, it can look different for everyone. here a 10 would be setting boundaries with in-laws. For example, saying, I don't want to come visit you next week. That might actually lead to a confrontation either with the in-laws or with your partner. So that's a very scary situation. So that might be a 10. If I would do that, I would feel maximum distressed, maximum scared. An easier situation would be, for example, returning a meal in a restaurant. So that would be maybe a 2 or a 3. I see a raised hand. I just want to ask you to write your question down in the Q&A section or your comment, and I will get to it very shortly. And then start, actively exposing yourself to those situations, and try to start with situations around a 3, a 4, or a 5. And you will see there's some of them that you can actually, actively plan. You can plan to go to a restaurant and return the meal. And the reason why this works is because if you just expose yourself to the situation and feel the fear that it brings up, you will, first of all, learn what kind of feared outcomes do come true and what feared outcomes do not come true. Oftentimes, those fears are exaggerated. Are just, for example, I have this client, she definitely has this approval seeking pattern, and she is in a relationship that just got more serious, and they had their first fight, and she told me, Sophia, we had this fight, and just the whole time I thought he's just gonna get up and leave, he's just gonna get up and leave. And that's what her fear told her. At the same time, she told herself, no, he's not, like, we're just having a fight, right? There's this other part of her healthy adult, that tells her, no, everything's fine. But in her, like, this pattern, basically, this is what it evokes: an irrational fear of being left alone because I'm not pleasing right now. So exposing herself to those situations, just like she did, by the way, that was a huge success, because she actually started this fight, um, can lead to the realization, oh, well, but he didn't leave. And it was super scary, but I was strong enough to be in the state of fear and survive. Um, and those are really corrective experiences that you can make. And then if you do it in this hierarchy, once you've managed situations that you would say have a distress level of 3, 4, the other ones will seem a little less distressing, right? So at some point, the 10 will all of a sudden seem doable. So you just work yourself up. Okay, that's it for today. The things that I want you to take home from this presentation would be that approval seeking is a learned behavior that was necessary once, that you needed, that protected you at one point, and that is problematic now. And that's why it's also hard to let go of. It is a reaction to feeling like you have to meet certain standards to be accepted, loved, or valued, in connection with a deep fear of conflict or abandonment. And people suffering from hair pulling disorder most likely have a higher chance to also show this pattern of behavior, according to research. People pleasing can lead to a certain feeling of relief and safety in the short term. That's why we engage in this behavior again and again. But we have to remember that in the long term, it actually has a lot of negative consequences, not only for yourself because you're neglecting your own needs, but actually, usually, it is also detrimental to your relationships. And that's kind of the lie that this pattern tells you. It tells you you're saving the relationship, but you're actually damaging it. In order to stop, it is important to increase awareness for the triggers and moments it happens, and then gradually face your fears to create new learning experiences. Yep. That's it for today. Before we jump into the Q&A section, just a reminder that we have a lot of free resources here at TrickStop. Obviously, the webinars, but also our online forums and blogs on our website. You can also find the recording of this webinar on our website, but you can also find it on our YouTube page, trickstop.com. And you can find us on all the social channels: Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, etc. If you feel like TrickStop might be a good choice for you right now, if you want to try out this evidence-based therapy that gives you also guidance by professional therapists, then you can use our discount code webinar 100 for your first subscription to get a $100 discount. All right. Okay. So let's do the Q&A section. We have about 10 minutes left, and I see um, we have two questions. The first one, can I please have the slides sent to me? I'm driving right now and not able to notes that I need to. Well, first of all, that's amazing. That actually both of them. Can we get the slides, please? I'm not sure, actually, to be honest, in terms of the copyright. I mean, I made those slides, obviously. I have to just check that with our team, but in the meanwhile, you can write to our customer support, and also you can just rewatch the presentation on YouTube and then make your notes or take screenshots the slides. Another question. How do I change a pattern that has already been established in a relationship? Oh, that is an interesting question. I like this question because usually what we say is you have the first relationship with your um, birth family, your primary caregivers, and that's where those patterns emerge. And I just want to stress again, that doesn't mean that you're not coming from a loving family where your parents did the best that they could. It's just no parent ever can do it all right. Um, okay, wait. There's a fault. This is with my mother. You mean how okay. My assumption was you meant you have this pattern from childhood and now you're in a relationship with a partner and you kind of have the same pattern. How can you change it? But actually you're saying, how can I change the same pattern with the person where the pattern actually developed? Um, if I understand that question correctly, then that is the hardest. That is the hardest because changing the pattern in the relationship where the pattern actually originated is the scariest of them all. That's why it's easier to work on those patterns as adults because then we have different relationships. We have relationships with our friends and with our partner, and there we're more likely to make different experiences. The experience, for example, to set a boundary and have the other person accept it. Whereas with the people where the pattern actually developed with are more likely to show reactions that are going to be very difficult for us, right? So my first recommendation would be to start with friends and relationships and then move on to your parents. Although sometimes parents, when they get older, also, I mean, they change, they become softer. It might be easier now. Also, you're not a child anymore. So obviously, it's definitely possible to change this pattern also with, for example, your mom, but it still will be the hardest because the expectations, the fear will be the strongest. So I would start with other people and then build up the courage to also start with your mom. Just really be prepared for what that might do to your relationship with her, right? It might lead to some distance for a while, but sometimes that's exactly what you need. Yeah. I hope that answered the question a little bit. It's very, very complicated. That's why. Yeah. There's an I've always been a people pleaser for her. Yeah, I know that's how it comes about. And with her, it's always going to be the hardest to stop with the pleasing. But if you have this kind of relationship with your mom where you always put your own needs second, then it's still worth it to draw those boundaries, even if you feel that then in the short term it's going to challenge the relationship, because I mean, that's a difficult relationship to be in. But that's something that definitely I would also advise you to work on in therapy with a therapist where you have more details and also have the safe place to, when you manage to set a boundary with your mom, for example, to go back to the safe place and process, because it's really not easy. It's not easy. Okay. Is there a difference between people pleasing and not wanting to hurt someone? I feel like my struggle isn't so much about how I feel, but how the other person will feel. Um, is there a difference between people pleasing and not wanting to hurt someone? I guess they can overlap, the two of them. Just when you're people pleasing, it's more about being scared that if I other hurt the other person, they will love me less. But obviously, as I mentioned, people who engage in this people pleasing behavior often are very empathetic. And the idea that if they set a boundary, the other person will be mad at them is not, doesn't only come from a selfish place of like, they're not going to like me as much, but also from like, I don't want them to hurt. Um, and sometimes we will engage in this behavior just to spare another person's behavior, the feelings, right? And that's okay. But if that's what you're always doing or usually doing, then it's not good, because you're still hurting the other person's feeling. Because if that is a person who loves you, they will not want you to always spare their feelings and kind of take the hit yourself and put your needs aside. They wouldn't want that. And if they would find that out eventually, they would feel very sad if they really love you, right? And also, always putting other people's emotions first will eventually lead to some kind of resentment with you. So just um, one psychologist that I really like that actually taught a seminar on relationships, they said just consider you have two legs. You have the pleasing leg that builds connection, that puts the other person's feelings and needs first, and that's a very important leg. And then you have the other leg, the blue leg, that sets boundaries and takes care of your own needs. And you have to stand on both feet, right? You cannot rely on only one leg. That will destroy the relationship. Okay, well, a lot of cool questions. Um, well, I think that's actually a person who related to this other question. I think to change that kind of pattern, you have to set boundaries with the person it emerged with. Um, I would agree that if you manage to set boundaries with the person the pattern emerged with, probably everything else after that might seem easier. But I have experienced with clients that um, they did manage to set boundaries in different relationships. They didn't manage yet to do it with, for example, their birth parents. And that still means that they, had progress, like significant progress. But yes, it means that you haven't, broken the pattern completely. Another question. What if I did this when I was 10, but then I got into a long-term relationship and stopped? Now I've caused a lot of damage in the relationship, so now I pull it daily. Wait, does that relate to something else before? Do you mean the pulling now or the people pleasing? What if and my partner says she forgives me, but I still feel it was too bad and she's going to leave? Don't understand this question. No, I don't understand the question. I'm so sorry. Um, I'm gonna go to the next one. Are there cases of people who've learned to stop people pleasing, I guess, and subsequently then were able to stop hair pulling and or skin picking? Oh, that's a good question. Um, I don't think that solely working on this people pleasing pattern will completely stop the picking or pulling. Because even if the approval seeking pattern was one of the maybe reasons why the pulling behavior first appeared, it then becomes its own thing, right? And usually it is not connected only to this trigger, it kind of connects to all kinds of situations in your life. But I definitely had the experience that in therapy, we noticed that not being able to set boundaries and then dealing with the negative emotions in the long run were some of the reasons why pulling occurred. And then once those clients were able to set more boundaries and take better care of themselves, also, by the way, boundaries at work, boundaries in terms of how much um, I help other people out, just how much stress I put on myself. And that really benefited the process and really helped with the pulling. I just always think, in addition to working on those roots, um, you also always have to learn how to cope with the pulling on a more symptom level in terms of competing response, because it becomes its own thing with time. I hope that answers the question. And then there is a last question about insurance. So, okay, I'm going to answer the two last questions. In terms of insurance, we actually have a section on that on our TrickStop website that explains it really well. We don't work with insurance here at TrickStop. You can inquire, or you can ask with your insurance whether they would cover the program. Just be aware of the fact that oftentimes the coverage is only partial and that your payments might be increased. So but if you find out that your insurance will cover for it, then our customer service will definitely give you all the information or documents that you need to arrange that. Okay. And one last question. How do I stop pulling my hair if I'm in a long-term relationship and have caused a lot of damage in the relationship? Will I ever be able to stop pulling my hair if I stay in the relationship? So you mean you are in this relationship, you caused a lot of damage in the relationship. I hope not because of the pulling, because I think that in a relationship, our partner has to accept us with all, the different sides to us. Um, but if you feel like the relationship and the fact that your relationship is not in a good place, um, causes you to pull your hair more, or leads to the fact that right now you have trouble coping with the pulling, or stopping with it, then I think you have to really reflect with yourself whether this relationship is a top priority to you, right? Your relationship, your adult relationship with your partner usually becomes the most important relationship to you. And if this is the partner that you want to be with, then, and you know that, then you have to now do damage control, right? Maybe couples counseling, maybe have some really difficult conversations, and accept that right now the relationship is also a trigger for your pulling. But I would first and foremost save this relationship if it's important to you. And then once things in the relationship have settled down, go back to the pulling and work on that. But it sounds like a more complex topic that maybe also would be very interesting to talk about with a therapist who really has the chance to get to know you and all the details. All right, we're absolutely out of time. Thank you, everyone, for joining, for asking those wonderful and interesting questions. I hope I'm going to see you for the next webinar next month. And in the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day wherever you are.